Welcome to Meteorology Matters. If you want to learn even more about weather and climate change, you can follow me, meteorologist Rob Jones, on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. On Instagram, I'm meteorologist. On TikTok, it's TV meteorologist. And on YouTube, search for Rob Jones Hurricane. That's also where you'll find the Meteorology Matters playlist.
Sounds good.
On today's show, we're diving into some major developments with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and recent disaster trends.
Okay.
You shared some pretty concerning information that suggests a potentially really challenging future for disaster response.
Right.
And it's especially true when you consider this really alarming increase in major weather-related events.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's try to unpack this. The heart of what you've been looking at seems to be this potential shift in how the nation prepares for and responds to major disasters. And all of this is happening right when these events are seemingly becoming more and more frequent.
Yeah. It really seems like a critical moment.
So let's start with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Okay.
The information you've highlighted paints a picture of some pretty serious turmoil within the agency.
Yeah. There have been some really concerning reports. There's this apparent aim of the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, to eliminate FEMA.
Wow.
I mean, that's a pretty big deal. And there have been these meetings between top officials from FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay.
And they're literally talking about shutting down the agency.
So what would that even look like?
Well, that's the big question. Some are even saying we should just skip the whole FEMA Review Council thing.
The council that was just formed, right?
Yeah, but just get rid of it.
To speed up the dismantling of the agency.
Exactly. And what's really worrying is that this is all happening as we're heading right into hurricane season.
That's a problem.
One FEMA official even said that usually by March, they've got all their hurricane plans finalized.
Right.
But this year, everything's on hold because of all this uncertainty. So it's really raising questions about whether they'll even be ready.
And it's not just future planning that's being affected.
Right.
There's this new rule that requires Secretary Noem's team to personally approve the renewal of terms for lots of FEMA workers.
Like a lot of workers.
And this is effective immediately.
It's a huge shift. And it's not just some administrative positions. It's the people who are actually out there on the ground responding to disasters.
The boots on the ground.
Exactly. The people who verify damage, the ones who operate those recovery centers, the ones who are helping victims register for aid.
So the essential workers?
All of them. We're talking about the cadre of on-call response employees, the reservists, local hires, temporary full-time employees. It's a huge chunk of FEMA's workforce, something like 74%.
Wow, that's most of FEMA.
Exactly. And a lot of these positions are term positions, which means they could easily just expire and not be renewed.
So what happens if there's a major disaster and FEMA doesn't have enough people to respond?
It's a scary thought. And what's really concerning is that states are apparently afraid to speak up about these changes because they don't want any fallout.
So they're worried about repercussions.
Yeah. They're worried that if they complain, they might get less support from FEMA in the future.
So everyone's just kind of stuck.
Basically. And it means that instead of focusing on getting ready for hurricane season, FEMA officials are spending all their time trying to justify why they need to keep certain employees.
That seems like a huge distraction.
It is. It's a huge waste of time and resources.
Yeah.
And then there's the financial side of things. Over $100 billion in grant money, and disaster assistance was frozen because of executive orders.
That's a lot of money.
It's a huge amount. And a lot of that money was supposed to go to immigration programs and sanctuary cities, but there were also funds for other things like fire departments and hurricane recovery efforts.
So basically all FEMA payments that weren't directly related to individual disaster assistance were paused.
Right. So states and localities and nonprofits are all waiting for reimbursements.
What was that about some FEMA employees being fired?
Yeah, 4 employees, including the chief financial officer, were let go because they approved grant money to New York City for migrant sheltering.
Okay.
And the Department of Homeland Security basically accused them of laundering forbidden funding.
Oh, wow.
So now everyone at FEMA is terrified of losing their jobs if they make even the smallest mistake.
It must be a very tense environment.
It is. Especially since there's also a hiring freeze in place, so FEMA is losing staff and they can't replace them.
It's like they're being squeezed from all sides.
Exactly. And then to add to all of this, the acting administrator of FEMA sent out an email about a plan to reduce FEMA's workforce. They're talking about consolidating functions and maybe changing the geographic footprint.
It sounds like a major overhaul.
It is. But the final decisions are going to be made by the FEMA Review Council, and it's unclear how that will play out.
Okay.
The Department of Homeland Security is backing all of this. They say they're all about eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse.
So the administration is fully behind these changes.
It seems that way. And all of this is happening while there's this bipartisan effort in Congress to actually make FEMA independent from the Department of Homeland Security.
Really?
Yeah. There's this bill called the FEMA Independence Act. It would make FEMA a cabinet-level agency that reports directly to the president. The idea is to cut through all the red tape and make FEMA more responsive.
I guess it makes sense given the increasing number of disasters.
It does, and it shows that there's at least some bipartisan agreement on the importance of having a strong disaster response agency.
So let's shift gears now and talk about the actual increase in major disaster declarations. The data from NOAA and FEMA is pretty startling.
It is. In 2024, there were 90 major disaster declarations in the U.S.
90.
90. That's almost double the 30-year average of 55.
That's a huge jump.
It is. And if you do the math, it works out to one new major disaster declaration every 4 days. And that's not even counting all the emergency declarations. In 2024, there were a total of 108 disaster and emergency declarations. So that's like one every 3 days.
So we're seeing an increase across the board.
Exactly. And it's affecting a lot of people. In 2024, 137 million people were living in areas affected by a major disaster or emergency declaration. That's 41% of the population.
That's a lot of people.
And for major disasters specifically, it was 116 million people, or 34% of the population.
So it's a significant portion of the country that's being impacted.
It is, and the summer months were particularly bad, especially July and August. At one point, there were 10 major disasters active at the same time.
10 at the same time.
10. And during hurricane season, there was an average of 4 major disasters active every day.
So for most of the year, there was at least one major disaster happening somewhere in the U.S.
Yeah, for 73% of the year, to be exact.
That's crazy.
And if you add up all the days that were spent under major disaster declarations in 2024, it comes to 929 days. That's like 2.5 years.
2.5 years of major disasters.
If you include emergency declarations, too, it's 1,251 days.
That's a lot.
It is. And it's expensive. In 2024, there were 27 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the U.S.
Billion with a B.
Billion with a B. That's according to NOAA. And that's not even counting things like chemical spills or other non-weather-related disasters.
So what's driving this increase in disasters?
Well, climate change is a big factor. Climate scientists are saying that as the air gets warmer, it can hold more water vapor, which means we're seeing heavier rainfall during hurricanes and thunderstorms.
Which makes those storms more intense.
Exactly. And a lot of our infrastructure was designed based on past climate conditions, not the conditions we're seeing now.
So we're not prepared for these more intense storms.
Right. And that means we're more vulnerable to things like flooding.
It's all pretty alarming, especially when you consider the state of FEMA right now.
It is. Former FEMA Chief Dean Criswell has talked about how hurricane seasons are getting longer, spring severe weather is getting worse, and fire season is basically year-round now.
So it's not just our perception, it's actually happening.
It is, and it's putting a huge strain on FEMA.
Right, and then there's this talk of downsizing FEMA and changing how it operates.
It's a really tough situation. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds for FEMA, and that's making it hard for them to plan and prepare for the next disaster.
And the next disaster is always coming.
Exactly. And it's probably going to be worse than the last one.
That's a sobering thought. But what can we do?
Well, we need to start taking climate change seriously and investing in things that will make our communities more resilient.
Like stronger building codes.
Exactly. And early warning systems and things like flood barriers. We need to be proactive, not reactive.
That makes sense. And what about FEMA?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Whether they'll be able to adapt to this new reality of more frequent and more intense disasters.
And whether they'll even be around to do it.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, it's a good time to start thinking about your own preparedness.
What can you do to get ready for the next disaster?
What resources are available in your community? These are important questions to ask.
Definitely. Well, this has been a really eye-opening conversation.
I agree. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's important information. So I encourage everyone listening to follow me, meteorologist Rob Jones, on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. I share a lot of information about weather and climate change, and I try to make it as accessible and engaging as possible.
That's great.
You can find me on Instagram at Meteorologist, on TikTok at TV Meteorologist, and on YouTube, search for Rob Jones Hurricane. That's also where you'll find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
I'll see you next time on Meteorology Matters.
See you.
Bye.